Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. Last September, Santa Clara County in California launched a first-in-the-nation program to provide $1,000 monthly payments to youth aging out of foster care. And under this pilot, 72 recipients were selected to receive monthly checks. All were around the age of 24, which is the age when most foster youth lose access to county services. And according to the initial report, this modest stipend has really been a lifeline to people who would otherwise have very little support. And now, the chief architect of the Santa Clara Basic Income Program for Foster Youth, California State Senator Dave Cortese, has introduced legislation to bring the program statewide. And under his bill, SB 739, around 2,500 transitioning foster care youth across California would receive direct cash payments of $1,000 per month for 3 years. Now, this idea of a universal basic income is starting to pick up steam across the country, and this is largely because of the economic desperation that has been fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic. And it makes sense that foster youth would be the first group of people to receive this sort of benefit. Foster youth are some of the most vulnerable groups in our community to begin with. Many kids enter the foster care system because of neglect, abuse, or other challenges that they or their families might be facing. And recovering from these challenges can be a lifelong struggle, which makes support as people age out of foster care even more important. So think of it this way: more and more in this country, if you are in your 20s, you are likely to be getting some sort of support from family, whether that's housing or financial support. And this trend has exacerbated throughout the years, particularly through the pandemic. And that's, again, because of the economic issues that have been fueled by the pandemic in this recent year. And so with all of these compounding factors, the transition to financial independence has become more and more difficult. And all of this, of course, only hits foster youth harder. They have no family system to be able to fall back on. And it's also important to note that children in foster care overwhelmingly come from low-income families living in marginalized communities that suffer from the effects of systemic racism. So they enter care often because the state assesses their parents as being unable or unwilling to adequately care for them. And this is most often due to perceived neglect of their basic needs as a result of poverty. And so because this is really an issue that is rooted in structural inequity, all of this tends to affect children of color the worst. And so by providing foster youth with a guaranteed monthly income, California could give so many young people the financial support that they need to get by and to have a better chance of building a life of their own. And so here today with us to talk more about this proposal, I'm joined now by the bill's sponsor, State Senator Dave Cortese, and San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin, who has officially announced his support for SB 739 as a non-legislative co-sponsor. So thank you both so much for being here today. Senator, I'd love to start with you. Maybe you can start by giving us a status update on the debate over SB 739. What's the pitch you've been making to your colleagues, and how receptive have they been?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about SB 739 and guaranteed income for foster youth, and just the opportunity to get the word out. And of course, I'm very grateful to District Attorney Boudin for his support. And we haven't had a chance to talk that much, so I'm eager to hear his perspective as well. I'm sure it will be significant, and that's appreciated. Here in the state Senate, in the state Capitol, where I am now, the bill has passed its first hurdle, which is to get out of its first hearing in the Senate Human Resources Committee. The Senate Human Services Committee, and it's out. It's into the Appropriations Committee now. That committee has to make a decision whether to move the bill forward, subject to appropriations. This does cost some money. At least on the front end. We can talk about that more. There's a strong belief system by those who understand local government and the business model of local government that the front end costs are more than made up by the savings downstream, if you will, in terms of keeping young people out of trouble, out of other systems that counties provide. But it's moving along. I feel very grateful that, this has been received so well so far. Just to give you an idea, I love telling little backstories, and this is just a glimpse. In one of our subcommittee discussions over Zoom a couple of months ago, people were sharing the bills that they were going to introduce just as an exercise amongst our own caucus. When I said UBI for foster, there was dead silence. That never gives you a great feeling when you're presenting something that you're very excited about. But I just think perhaps people weren't expecting it. It got out of committee without problem with flying colors. And I spoke to our budget subcommittee chair recently, and she's very, very positive about the program. So looking forward to moving forward.
So Dia Boudin, as a former public defender and now a prosecutor, I think what was really interesting to hear the senator talk about is sort of on the back end, how this could end up keeping kids out of other institutions like the criminal legal system, I'm assuming is one of those institutions. So you must see plenty of instances of people who've been involved in the foster system who go on to be involved in the criminal legal system, whether they're people who commit crime or people who are harmed by crime. So talk to us about your experiences observing the intersection of these two systems and how those observations have shaped your support for this bill.
Well, thank you, Alana. And I just really want to acknowledge the leadership of the senator on this critical issue. For me, the priority is always public safety. And this is a bill that helps us to promote, protect, and build safety for some of our most vulnerable community members. As of September of 2019, there were approximately 424,000 children in foster care across this country. And, we know that group, especially as they age out of foster care, are extremely vulnerable. They're more likely to end up with some engagement in the criminal justice system, either as people accused or as victims of crime. They're more likely to have difficult outcomes with employment and housing and mental health care. And one of the things, basic common sense things that we can do is propose in this bill. We can provide universal basic income to a known, identified, and discrete vulnerable population. And in so doing, we can help prevent crimes, we can help avoid contact with the criminal justice system, and we can help young people start their lives off on a path to success. The COVID-19 pandemic has only worsened the challenges that are faced by transition-aged foster care youth. There was a Foster Club May 2020 poll of young people in foster care, and it showed that nearly 65% of transition-age foster care youth had lost their jobs. More than half did not receive a stimulus check, and nearly 20% had run out of food. Almost a quarter were at risk of losing their housing. These are the kinds of serious, grave social problems that put the foster youth at risk and the rest of us at risk. And so this bill is a real testament to the commitment we have in San Francisco. And again, I want to acknowledge Senator Cortesi's leadership to protect and prevent crime, not simply punish it. This is how we build safety.
So just to follow up on that, I know that this must be a bill that's personal to you in a lot of ways, because you yourself have talked about how you grew up separated from your parents who were incarcerated when you were young. And I know it's a little bit different because you had support from your adoptive parents and other family members, but I'm curious if that shapes your view on this at all.
For sure. I grew up, as you said, Alana, from the time I was a year old, visiting both of my biological parents in prison. And I was really lucky in that I was adopted into a stable family that raised me as one of their own sons. But so many children with incarcerated parents, or so many children of people who've been victimized by crime or killed, end up in foster care. And we know, all of us know, that family support and parental guidance continues to play a critical role in our ability to succeed in life long after we move out of the home, right? While we're in college or while we're in our first jobs. And for so many thousands of young people in California and many more across the country, when you age out of foster care, there's nothing there for you. There's no support. There's no runway to launch a career or get your first apartment lease signed. And this bill will help fill that critical gap. It will help ensure that that transition is successful and crime-free in ways that address really longstanding and often ignored needs of an entire generation of young people who've grown up impacted by incarceration or by other forms of life circumstances that lead them to foster care.
Yeah. Senator, I want to turn a little bit to you because I'm interested to sort of talk about how we're going to see this change the trajectory of young people's lives. And maybe we can turn to some of the results of the pilot in order to sort of think through that. So for young people who are receiving these sorts of the stimulus money, how are we going to see people spending it? How is it going to change the way that they develop throughout their future and keep them out of the criminal legal system? And also, there's going to be some data that's going to be collected to actually see how that's going to turn out with this bill. So can you talk a little bit about those two things, sort of what the results have been in the pilot program and also how we expect these results to turn out across the state and what sort of data will be used to measure it?
Where we have data, the data shows success in very, very few problems. Maybe one or two falling out type situations in Santa Clara County of the 72. That's a pretty good track record on just about anything. In Stockton, where they ran UBI, what they found out was that the folks who were getting those dollars ended up about twice as likely to be employed as those who didn't. So we expect that to happen with foster youth. We've seen a little bit of that in Santa Clara County. In all the things that Mr. Bodine just highlighted in terms of those areas of the system where foster youth are extraordinarily likely to be overrepresented. The justice system, the homelessness statistics and numbers, the dropout rate. And now when you're talking about transitional age youth, people say, well, they're beyond high school. Only half have a high school diploma at that age. And to go back, try to support yourself. Many of us have been there, right? At 21 years old, and try to continue your education is a big lift for all young people. And these young people are all of our children. They're the state's kids through the counties. They are the taxpayers' kids, therefore. I have my 4 children, and I also view this, in terms of my lens, as having these other children, which I share with all of you, or all of the Californians who are paying taxes into the system. These are our kids, and we have the same kind of responsibility for them. In terms of just a basic vision, when I was a young person growing up in East San Jose, there were foster youth, of course, but there were just generally youth who were significantly disadvantaged compared to others growing up in what we now know as Silicon Valley. I had a friend named Jack, who was one of 7 brothers. His mom was a school bus driver. She didn't have adequate income to support her kids, let alone during their transition age. In fact, she needed them to transition into jobs to help support her and the rest of the children. And that's what happened to Jack. And he came to me one day because he was visiting the house. He was dating the sister of a famous Cal quarterback who came out of San Jose. And he said, wow, was that an eye opener? And I said, what? And he said, I realize now the difference between me and so-and-so, the Cal quarterback. I won't say his name. And I said, what? And he said, support. He said, I had a full scholarship to go to college and play football too. He said, but my mother said I need to go to work to help support the rest of the family. And this is analogous to the situation that foster youth are in, except even more attenuated because their foster family is literally gone. At least Jack, had a home, had a room to go back to, even during that struggle. So those are the kind of things over the years that have opened up my eyes and made me feel like part of my legislative purpose here needs to be and for all of us needs to be to provide that support to level the playing field, so the Jacks of the world have the opportunity, to be Cal quarterbacks or Bolt Hall attorneys or district attorneys or state legislators or whatever it is they dream of.
Are you receiving any sort of pushback on this bill? And I'm assuming if you are, and what sort of arguments are you using to sort of counter that?
UBI or guaranteed income typically gets the pushback of why doesn't somebody give me money? Why doesn't somebody give my kids money? Why don't you teach them work ethic instead of giving them a handout? I do believe that the foster population is a much more difficult population for those same critics to criticize because they are children of the state. We already are supporting them, either, as we've discussed many times here during the show, either after the fact, or ahead of time. It clearly is a situation of pay now or pay later. But I believe, and I know my counterpart in the district attorney's office knows and believes that the results of a 3-year pilot, if we run this statewide, will demonstrate to the world that this doesn't weaken work ethic. It in fact will give these young people a chance to get their footing, to continue their education, to feed themselves, to rent a room, or whatever it is they need to do in a non-prescriptive way to empower them to go get that job or that job training. That's what we're going to see when this bill gets signed into law.
That's exactly right. And I'll just weigh in. We're looking at a really discrete and vulnerable group. There's about 2,500 young people a year who age out of foster care in California. And so we're looking at a population where, you may have a young woman who ends up in an abusive relationship because of her economic dependence on a partner. This would give her a lifeline to independence and to safety. You may have a young man who gets invited for a job interview, but doesn't have clothes that are appropriate to wear. This would allow that young man or that young woman to buy clothes and make themselves presentable for their job interview and actually set themselves up to succeed. We don't want to see these same folks stuck in abusive relationships or stealing to get that food on the table or that interview outfit that they need for that first job. This is how we promote safety. This is how we encourage work ethic. This is how we set young people up who, have been essentially all of our children. As the senator said, these are all of our children. And just the same way that my parents continued to support me, after I went to college and as I was looking for my first job and my first apartment, this is an opportunity for all of us across the state of California to continue to look out for some of our most vulnerable children, for children that we all have a responsibility to, and who we know their success is our success.
That makes sense.
I would add, if I may, $1,000 is $1,000. It's still a chunk of money for a lot of people. But this isn't money that's going to be hoarded. This isn't money that's setting somebody's savings account ahead of their neighbor. This is money that's going to go directly into cash registers. It's going to go directly into grocery stores. It's going to go directly into what we, during the pandemic, have called economic stimulus. And I'd say to my most conservative critics, realize that, the ultimate stimulus program is helping a young person get on their feet by going to the nearest shop or store and investing in the things that they need, which is exactly what business needs them to do right now as well.
Now, a lot of the sort of supports that you're talking about that this money will give. So, for example, DA Boudin, you mentioned that it'll help somebody get out of an abusive relationship, or it will, somebody can, buy a suit for their job interview, those sorts of things. But there are also critics who say that there are people who will not use money on those things. They won't use the money on things that bring stability. So I'd like to hear from really either of you what your response is to those critics who say that people might just use this money on things that wouldn't bring them stability. Senator, DA, I'll start with you.
The Pope says it really well. The Pope says that when you give money to someone, it stops being your money and starts being their money. And one of the things that we want to teach young people is financial decision making. That's a critical part of being a successful adult. It's a critical part of knowing what to do with your paycheck and figuring out how to manage your accounts. And so, will there be some people who make financial decisions that are poor or that we might disagree with? Of course, there will be. There are every day. That's a part of the learning process. That's a part of becoming an adult and being independent. And we want young people to have that opportunity. Some of us were privileged enough to have a clothing allowance or some other kind of allowance from our parents. And, we made mistakes when we spent the money and we learned hard lessons that way. I'm confident that this investment from the state is a good investment in our future, it's a good investment in our young people, and that whatever mistakes individuals may make along the way, they will learn the lessons just like all of us have in our own financial decision making.
And I would add to, remember the one thing that this group of young people has that perhaps my children don't have direct access to are a number of supports that the counties are providing if they want it, in terms of financial planning, in terms of assistance with education planning and so forth. So they're not going to be out there on their own trying to figure things out without any help. And, the Giselle Huff, who organized in the name of her late son, her Foundation for Humanity, and talked me into going down this path in the first place. She made the greatest point, and she said, the conservative approach of being overly prescriptive with how we help people has failed us. And all you have to do is look at the numbers with foster youth. Our district attorney recited those earlier. It's time to try something else. What happens is the system wants to tell all of the foster youth, here's some money for housing, but some of them have housing. And what they really need money for is food. So how do they use a housing voucher for food? Some of them might need a little help buying clothes or making part of their car payment so they can get to their job. How do they use a food voucher for that? And this is an old conservative ideology that we've all fallen prey to that goes beyond 50 or 60 years in terms of what we used to call the welfare system, which basically says we, the conservative folks running the government, we know best what you need. It's a voucher, it's food stamps, or it's housing. No, it hasn't worked. It's failed us. And what seems to be working based on the early UBI pilots is exactly what our district attorney just said. Empower them to go use those dollars for what they need to chase, what their dreams are and what their needs are. And it seems to be working.
So, Dean, when we talk about the power of economic stability to prevent criminal behavior and to help people thrive, do you think it's necessary for people beyond foster youth? I mean, it seems like all the reasons that we've just described, that this could make sense for other people who are overrepresented in the criminal legal system. Or do you think there are other groups that this sort of program could help?
It's a great question, Alana. We look at the folks who end up getting arrested and booked into our county jail, and such a high percentage of them are people who suffer from either, addiction or housing instability or lack of economic opportunities. And, those may not be justifications for committing a crime. But if we're serious about public safety, as I am, then we need to find ways to prevent those crimes from occurring, to prevent people from getting arrested in the first place. And we know that when unemployment goes up, so do things like property crime. And these kinds of universal basic income programs are a tried and tested part of government policy in countries in Europe that have far lower crime rates than we do in the United States. I think there's a lot of room to explore expanding these kinds of pilots to other vulnerable groups, vulnerable to being victimized by crime and to being arrested for crime committed sometimes because of desperation that we can avoid for far lower cost and with a far more humane government intervention than incarceration on the back end.
Senator, I have one last short question for you. I want to pull up some polling, or I want to talk about some polling. There was a recent poll from Data for Progress in the appeal that showed that 59% of likely voters support piloting local guaranteed income programs that provide direct cash payments of $500 to $1,000 per month to people in need. Is this something that surprises you?
It's something that's shifted over the last couple of years, and I'm sure the pandemic has something to do with that. I'm sure that people seeing stimulus checks in how those actually get used and how those benefit people, that may have helped shifted ideology a little bit. I think fundamentally the American people want to see how this works. You know, we are an innovating people. Our very government was an experiment in innovation, and we should never stop innovating around, you know, what works for people in this democratic system that we're in. And I just think, you know, I'm gratified to hear those numbers. I'm a little bit surprised, but I'm not entirely surprised because the voters usually get it right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today and for talking about this really exciting piece of legislation. Best of luck with moving it forward, and I look forward to talking with you both soon.
Thank you
so much.
So talking about this legislation today, it sort of makes me think about sort of the wide range of topics we cover here on the Appeal Live. If you're somebody who watches regularly, which there are some, you'll see that we cover all sorts of different topics having to do with right to counsel, different issues having to do with housing and the criminal legal system. And it might seem that they're not necessarily connected, but here's the common thread. And I think we could really see it in today's segment. It's a shift away from punitive approaches, from government providing punitive approaches, the criminal legal system, and instead making people's lives more whole who have been neglected by our government. And a program like this is exactly that. It says to foster youth, let's give you all of the things that people who have wealthy families have been able to get for decades. Let's give you those things and see how you thrive, because you will. Because foster youth are children of the state, really, and therefore we should treat them like human beings who deserve to thrive. And we also see that the same way that programs like a right to counsel program may cost some money in the beginning, eventually they end up saving money because it keeps people out of homelessness. And the same way that something like this, a UBI program for foster care youth, will keep them out of the criminal legal system, will also prevent them from being homeless as well. So it'll be really interesting to see the trajectory of this legislation, to see all of the youth that it will help. And we'll be following it very closely here on the Appeal Live. So thanks so much for tuning in today. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news.